wonder how you could incorporate pop culture in the college classroom? Ever consider the value of comics in teaching history? Or ever want to draw parallels between fandoms and course content? Historically, panels on pop culture in the classroom have prioritized K-12 students. But what about college students? There's a stigma that pop culture, fandom, and comics are not serious enough for them. On Thursday, October 6, 2022, a panel of 5 university professors from across various disciplines spoke at New York Comic Con. We presented a panel entitled Pop Culture, Fandom, and Comics in the College Classroom. In this panel, we shared how we incorporate pop culture into our own courses and how you might do the same, whether you're a professor or a student. From Taylor Swift to Game of Thrones, Supernatural, Marvel, DC, and more, we discussed the validity of pop culture in the college classroom. What follows here is our panel discussion from that day, along with a brief Q&A from the audience. We lost the answer to the last question, so it may appear to end a bit abruptly, but it does cover almost everything from that hour-long discussion. There will be a link in the show notes to this episode so you can check out the slides that we presented that day and connect with any of the panelists on social media or via email. Special thanks to New York Comic Con, the New York Public Library, and the panelists from that day: Heidi Bollinger, Jennifer Caroccio Maldonado, Tanya Cook, Asif Siddiqi, and myself, Rebecca Salois.
There we are. Okay. So I have a list of the panelists here. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a moment, and our contact information is here. I'll put it up on the slide at the end as well in case you don't catch it all now. And so I just put a couple of questions up here for the panelists. Who are you? What do you teach? And what pop culture are you into right now? I figured that would be a nice little icebreaker for us. So I'll start just to my left. My left. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dr. Heidi Bollinger. I teach at CUNY Ostos, which is a community college that serves the South Bronx. I'm the chair of the English department there, and I teach literature, composition, and an elective on graphic novels. Right now I'm into watching Lower Decks and catching up on Bob's Burgers, and I'm a real Murder, She Wrote fan, I have to say, for life.
Hi, I'm Tanya Cook. I teach sociology at the Community College of Aurora, so I came here despite my very vampire-y look. I'm here from sunny, beautiful Denver, Colorado. So I probably get some kind of award for traveled the furthest. Yeah.
On this panel for sure. We all came from New York.
Thanks. Okay, what else? What am I into? Is that the question?
Yeah, what do you teach and what are you?
I teach sociology. I'm enjoying The Rings of Power. I'm a little surprised how much I'm enjoying that. And also reading a book called The Fifth Season, which is a dystopian science fiction novel. It's very, very good. It's kind of a bummer, but it's exciting. Cool world building.
So I'm Asif Siddiqi. I'm a professor here at Fordham University in the Bronx. And I teach, among other things, I teach a course on the history of comics. So I'm actually probably the only historian here. So it has a slightly different kind of analytical bent, which I'll talk about. But I'm actually a historian of science. I'm starting to read a lot, right? And I also write on pop music and other lots of other things. So what am I into right now? I guess I've been watching that Andor show, which is kind of cool, surprisingly good, and listening to lots of music.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jennifer Caroccio Maldonado. I teach at CUNY Baruch College in Manhattan. Currently, I am teaching a Great Works class on Caribbean literature and also an American Lit class. But in the past, I've also taught Latinx literature, pop culture, comic adaptations. And right now, because it's Halloween, we're just getting into our kind of scary Halloween movies. So I think this weekend I'm definitely watching Arsenic and Old Lace. I don't know if that counts. But I'm pretty excited for that.
Awesome. And I'm Dr. Rebecca Salois. I also teach at Baruch College, CUNY, although Jennifer and I are just meeting today in person for the first time. I feel like we're kind of mirror images. I teach in the Black and Latino Studies department, but I did teach in the English department prior to moving over there. And I am really into, there's this show right now on Apple TV called Bad Sisters, and it is phenomenal, and the villain is just the literal worst villain I've ever come across in any show, and you're rooting for his death the whole time. You know he dies, it's like the opening scene, so like now you're just like, how is it gonna happen? When is it gonna happen? Very, very good, so check it out if you can. All right, so I guess we will sort of jump into our discussions. I've kind of organized this in a way where each panelist can sort of speak to their specific studies, their specific field, how they use comics, how they use pop culture, fandom, and these sort of things in their different areas of study. So, you've got cultural studies, English, history, sociology. There's a pretty good spectrum here. So, I think first up is Heidi.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I teach an elective on graphic novels at the community college level. It appeals to digital design and animation students, but students from across the college take it. And my inclination when I designed the course was to focus on seminal examples of graphic novels, Will Eisner, Art Spiegelman, Marjane Satrapi, etc., some of the big names. But over and over, my students kept asking me to incorporate more manga, more Marvel comic books, and I, finally had to listen to them, and I'm so glad that I did. So I found Tom King, and Tom King's here today, but there's a long line, so I didn't get to talk to him, but I teach Tom King's The Vision. How many people are familiar? Okay. Oh, a lot. Great. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here in talking about this, and we all are in terms of the value. But so my tips are very simple. First, to really draw on the enthusiasm of students and the expertise of students. They know a lot more about comic books and graphic novels than I do, frankly. I focus on the formal elements and teaching students how to analyze the relationship of style and theme, the panel layout, the color, etc., and the thematic resonances of that. But, the most shy students will really start lighting up when they get to be the expert on the complicated genealogies of all these Marvel characters. So I like to let them get into the weeds a little bit with that and go down that rabbit hole and let them explain all these things to each other, because they're all familiar with Marvel to varying extents, right? Because it's mainstream to be a nerd now, which is great. So we really, I think, capitalizing on that is fantastic. But at the same time, my job as an educator is not to get tangled up in the intricacies of the Marvel universe, but to use a thread or a through line to help students explore the deep themes of this literature. We often start out with informal writing prompts that help the students start exploring the themes. Like my favorite one up there is about what superpower would you want and why, and what would you sacrifice to gain that superpower? And that leads into surprisingly personal and thoughtful discussions. And students have really compelling reasons, and they deeply understand the idea of the isolation of being a superhero, and the idea of being an outsider but being special really resonates with them, I find. I also find that this turned out to be the most complex and ambiguous text that students wrote about, because it raises a lot of questions about the human experience that it doesn't answer. If we could maybe go to the next slide. So we use a lot of, again, writing to discover activities to build to a formal paper, thinking about what can this story of monsters or synthezoids reveal to us about the human experience. In what ways are the Vision and his synthezoid family human or not human? What does that even mean? Is his flaw wanting to be more human? Is his failure to become more human? What makes him human? The paradox of that is really compelling for students. And So again, these themes of outsiders, monsters, community, belonging really resonate with my students, who are largely students of color, many of whom are first-generation Americans, first-generation college students. So in an allegorical or metaphorical way, this really appeals to them. The other thing I wanted to mention is that comics as serious literature are a good way to introduce students to the genealogical conversation outside of Marvel. So as you can see in the second image in the middle, the character is reading Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. And that text becomes a significant flashpoint. And my students are not familiar with that play, so we have to explain the character of Iago as an outsider. And then we think about how might that help us understand these Marvel characters more, and how does it add more layers. Not that I'm not elevating Shakespeare above, I'm just saying there's a conversation, and this is a really interesting network of texts that we have. Also in the last image, you'll see there's a Roy Lichtenstein pop art painting, and that idea of a painting being like a copy of a copy of a copy, this Scott McCloud also references, really resonates nicely with the synthezoids being kind of like copies of humans or simulacrum of humans. So it gets very intricate actually, and so students can write a whole paper just exploring one of these kind of human questions, and they love it. So I'll just stop there and save the rest for questions if there's any later. Thanks.
All right. So we're not going down the line because I organized these slides in advance, but next up will be Jennifer.
So for a course called Pop Culture in the Media, I was working with adaptation theory with my students because I feel like if they might not know the source material of the comics, they definitely know the movies or animated series. And one of, I think, my biggest goals has been with bringing comics into the classroom is to have students see that there's a place for them. And then also see that there's a place for them in comic fandom specifically. And so I had them look at clips and read the original Uncanny X-Men Days of Future Past. Then we watched the animated show, which also had adapted that storyline into the animated series. And then much contested film adaptation also did their own version. So we kind of use that as a way to think about what does it mean to adapt a story through different mediums. And also, particularly with the visuality of comics, animated shows, and movies, it's a great way for students to think about the body and the way that it's race, class, gendered, and ability. Not only super ability, but disability as well. I had them thinking through a cultural lens of how we can use particularly the different storylines within X-Men to think of ways of talking about marginalization specifically. And so some of the discussion questions I had them work with, often in small groups, was thinking about the ideology behind these comics. That's something I have them think about as well within the media, particularly about socialization. What are the lessons that we learn? What do we learn about other people? What do we learn about the world through what we watch, read, engage in? And then when it came to X-Men particularly, it's how are these different than the previous superheroes? So more, Superman, Batman, and other comics superheroes that we studied. And particularly looking at the social issues that are being alluded to, looking at those allegories that are being made. And then as well thinking about in the kind of larger concept of pop culture, what is, the story of X-Men or the characters, why have they become kind of going from fringe into more mainstream into pop culture? And then also looking at how the medium affects the message. I think it's important to think about, particularly with adaptations, how that's affecting the message, the story, the ideology when it's told in a comic book serialized over years versus an animated series, which as well can, run several seasons, and then like a standoff movie. And then lastly, what is being a mutant metaphor for? So just like the novel before that, comics are a form of literature, and it's a way for students to really think about narrative structure, and then also things like illusion metaphors. And so I've always felt particularly the world of X-Men is just really rich in that, and there's someone for everyone. And then lastly, I think it's just really important to meet students both where they are, so having them, as my other panelists have said, coming in with that specialized knowledge, but then also allowing them, to talk about those larger issues, particularly marginalization, because I think it's unfortunately kind of gets brushed under, and we kind of get boxed up in the metaphor when we're like, all right, if we're actually talking about ableism, hence why I'm wearing a mask, or if we're talking about racism or homophobia, let's name those things. And so I think it's really important for us as educators with students to help them to parse that out.
Love this. Like, I want to steal all of these ideas. This is fantastic. Asif, you're next.
Thank you. So, as I said, I'm a historian, and the way I teach my class, which is essentially, although it's the one I most recently taught, is the history of comics, but it's really focused on the history of the superhero genre, particularly. And the way I teach it is mostly as a history of both the comic book as an idiom. So we look at the history of comics let's say from the 1930s, the original sort of superheroes, Superman, Batman, that sort of stuff. And we track the evolution of the comic book idiom for the last 80, 90 years. But we look at content, obviously, in terms of how the content of the comic books works as a mode of social critique. It works as and also as a kind of record of history. So one of the questions I ask my students is what might we learn about American history through a set of selected comic books from the last 70, 80 years. And we kind of go through that process and reflect on that a little bit. I can talk about that more in the Q&A. The other way in which we study comic books is really through we study content, we study the industry, we study fandom, we study the creators, obviously. But the other way we do it is also through what about the merging of historical questions through comic books. So in this particular example that I offered, which many of you might be familiar, this was in 1971. Stanley and Gil Kane. I don't know if it's Jill or Gil, but Gil Kane was the artist. And this was a particularly important turning point in the history of Spider-Man, in which they sort of confronted it and portrayed drug use or abuse, whichever we might say. Harry Osborn here sort of gets addicted to drugs. And this was a big controversial fulcrum for the history of Marvel, because that was the first time they took off the Comics Code seal from the comic book, because Stan knew that basically they wouldn't allow this to be published. So, and this was a big deal to do that at that time. And of course, so we explore, how that happened, the implications of that, but also how the use of drugs or abuse is portrayed in the comic books, what's going on in broader American culture in the early 70s, late 60s. You have Elvis meeting President Nixon to talk about drug use, and those kinds of things. So we sort of explore the cultural background of it. And in terms of the content, we really look at, how are the writers, in this case Stan Lee, portraying drug use? Is it ham-fisted? Is it portraying an ambiguous position? Is it taking a stand on it? And in this case, there is kind of a stand. It's, drugs are bad, and we shouldn't use it. But there's an interesting thread running through it, which is that the drugs that Harry is using are produced by Osborn Industries, which is sort of an interesting spin on the corporate malfeasance. And the other example I have is, be very quick, which is Miss Marvel, much more contemporary. This is a story, there's many ways to parse this story out, obviously, as you know. Story of an immigrant family, a Muslim American, or the one way that I think of it as, there is an immigrant narrative here. So we talk about history of immigration in the U.S., and actually there's a comparison to a very other famous fictional immigrant, which is Superman, obviously. So we sort of work through the ways in which immigration has been portrayed in comic books, using this as a starting point. We also talk about class in this because there's after 2008, this is an unusual portrayal of a protagonist whose family is not, super rich or like Tony Stark or something. So they live in Jersey City. It's not like glamorous Manhattan. So we kind of work through some of those issues about being through American history. So I'll just stop here. There's a lot, I can say a lot more about it, but it's firmly grounded in history, so the questions are driven by those kinds of questions. It is also an American history course, so in that way, what the students get out of the course is they learn ultimately what does the comic book idiom do, how does it function as a historical form, both as a pedagogical tool, how can we learn American history, but also what is the history of comic books and what can that tell us?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I again love that idea of taking the history statistics and putting them side by side with the narrative and seeing a more well-rounded picture, right? All right, Tanya is going to shift us a little bit away from just comics, but to other forms of pop culture as well.
Yeah, hopefully. Hi. So I teach sociology, which is a little bit different, and I want to credit a couple sources here quickly, because, teachers, we got to credit academics. One is the book Fandom as Classroom Practice, edited by Catherine, last name starts with an H, and I'm blanking, forgive me. And then my colleague Jennifer Sims, who I graciously allowed me to borrow from her project that she uses in Sociology 100, Introduction to Sociology, which is most of what I teach. So most of my students are going into nursing, they're going into criminal justice, they are not sociology majors. They may or may not transfer right to a four-year school. I teach at a community college. But I love the way that fans engage with media and the way that it makes us think. And looking at what fans do, if you make fan vids, if you write fan fiction, right? If you make art, if you cosplay, this is all how we kind of express our cultural capital and blend that into making it our own. One of the key tenets of sociology is this idea of structure versus agency, right? Agency being, do you have free will? And the answer is sort of, maybe a little bit, right? And structure being all of the world and the things you find yourself dealing with. Who better exemplifies that than superheroes, right? Or any kind of hero's journey. You've got this path, whether or not you can navigate it, whether or not you can find the One Piece and became the pirates, right? I had to throw a One Piece reference in there. So these are some ways that I have used fan practices in the classroom. I'm going to talk, I think, today most specifically about Black Panther homework and, the Sociology of X project is what I call it. So if we can, and I'm happy to talk more about this, offline.
Next slide. Yes.
Okay, so this is, I kind of began with the end in mind, and these are steps in the Sociology of X. So working with students, they have to do a major out-of-class significant assignment that shows some sociology competencies, right? Just the way that we would kind of reverse design things. So this is kind of where we start. We pick a topic, we do an annotated bibliography, et cetera, et cetera. And then you'll notice the major step here is the product. So throughout the semester, in collaboration with the students, we design a project for them that meets their specific learning goals and needs. So the product is called that because it can be a paper, but it can also be a video. It can be a piece of art. And that's what I'm going to show you what students have done. It can be a podcast, which Bex, of course, knows a ton about, more than I do. And it's really fun. And they engage, they choose a fictional world to analyze or a piece of media. That can be anything from One Piece. I do have a student looking at this semester, to Lord of the Rings, to X-Men is one that is quite popular. You name it, Bridgerton, like any kind of fictional world, fantasy world. And we make it about sociology somehow so that they can pick sociological content and use it to understand that world better, which then in turn helps them understand those concepts. So it becomes this really cool synergy. I had to throw that word in. Okay. Yes, let's move ahead. So this is an example of a student who's a criminal justice major, and she chose the film End of Watch. Do people know this film? I believe I have seen this film, but you may have to help me a little bit. It's about gang violence and police in LA, correct? So she used broken windows theories of deviance and other learned deviance, differential associations theories. So she's really focusing on theories of crime and deviance in sociology. And this character in the film, she drew this art and drew this, these are two original art pieces, and then submitted an essay about what everything in this meant and how it connected back to the course concepts. And I just thought it was fantastic, but I get to look at, 100 of these things like this every semester, which is, let me tell you, way more fun than reading the same paper that nobody is excited to be doing and I'm not excited to be reading. And they often tell me, students, of course, we have to follow up and justify what we're doing, as you all know. And they tell me they spend more time, they learn more doing projects like this than a typical research paper. Yeah, I'll be quiet for now, I guess.
All right, everyone's going quite quickly. I was a little nervous because academics were known to speak quite a bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two different podcasts that I have posted that I have used as tools in my classroom that the students then sort of build off of. So the first one is a podcast called Why Do We Read This that I used when I taught the Great Works of Literature class that is a required class for all students at my college. Doesn't matter what their major is, doesn't matter if they've transferred in, every student has to take this class. They can take the old stuff or the new stuff, and new stuff is like 17th century and forward, right? So, and especially for students who sign up for that ancient text through 1650 half, I want to find a way to make them not necessarily care about the literature. I mean, I hope that happens, but I teach at a school that's predominantly business. It's very business heavy anyway. And so a lot of these students are just taking it for the requirement. So how do I get them to connect with the literature? Why do we read this? Why does it matter? Who cares, right? And so I have a few images up here of episodes that I've done. The first one you'll see there is Frodo and Samwise, along with Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And we talk about the idea of literary foils and sidekicks and sort of the importance of having that other character to balance out and to help you learn about it. And then when they're like, oh yeah, Lord of the Rings, like everyone's seen that, or most of them have seen that, it's very tricky to make sure you keep your references enough up to date as the students are getting younger and younger. Another one we read is Hedda Gabler. This is in the more contemporary half, and I did an episode with a colleague who she looked at Hedda's narcissistic behavior, and we talked about narcissism, and she compared it to Mother Gothel from Tangled. I looked at her as more a victim of society and seeing that she was sort of trapped in this space, and who else is trapped in this space but Regina George from Mean Girls, right? And getting them to say like, oh yeah, okay, so this thing, maybe it took place in 19th century Norway. Why do I care? Well, because these things are still happening today. And that's my third example is really great because we do these classic Tamil poetry, the lyrics from the 11th, 12th century, if I remember correctly. And I'm like, this just reminds me of Taylor Swift lyrics. Like, this is all about the different stages of relationships and different things. And they know that. They connect with that. They understand it. Some like it, some don't. And tell them you don't have to like everything. But find something in there. And the final one that I have on here as an image is Setnakamwas, which is a piece of literature I wasn't familiar with until my colleague introduced it to me. And she compared it to Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and like the complex story levels and all of that, which was beyond me, but like for a lot of my gaming students, they got it, right? I looked at Supernatural and that the Book of the Damned and that sort of cursed text. So At the end of the semester, I asked the students to create then their own parallel. Take anything we read in class and find your pop culture. What do you resonate with in the pop culture world? Whether it's comics, whether it's film, anything in between, and you draw that parallel based on one of the themes that we've covered. The second podcast is one that I'm still working on with a colleague of mine in the Black and Latino Studies department called Latinx Visions. And this is a podcast that we use to demonstrate the ways in which Latinidad is represented in the media or isn't, right? That's part of the conversation as well. So it really helps the students investigate like the real world reflections and implications of the works, not just in the Latinx cultures, but the different communities throughout. We focus primarily on US-based media, as you can see from some of my examples, right? We've got One Day at a Time. With that one, we talked about Latina representation and stereotypes, the difference between leaning in and rejecting stereotypes, but also, who's writing these stories and are they representative of the culture being portrayed. With Clap When You Land, which is a book by Elizabeth Acevedo, which is phenomenal. It's really great because for students who struggle with poetry, it's like a perfect balance for them. And we talk about family dynamics in Dominican families in that episode. And we also talk about things like neocolonialism and tourism, which when you're just reading the book, you're just, okay, this is cool, it's a good book. But if you stop and you think about those factors, it adds another layer. One of my favorite episodes was the Spider-Man one, Miles Morales. Of course, I'm absolutely, Spider-Verse is one of my favorite movies, I think. And then we talked about adaptations, as my colleagues talked about here. With Love, Victor, there's the this idea of positive but safe queer representation, which is really important for many of my students will speak up about this, like, hey, I'm hesitant to come out to my family for X, Y, and Z reasons. And some of those reasons are dealt with in this show. They would be like machismo and the worries around that in the family and religion. I think that's another one that comes to play in that show. And with Pose, we talk about the trans Latinx communities and we kind of go back into the historical setting. So those are just some of the ways in which we create these tools that students can then use to take in, like, listen to a podcast instead of reading 80 articles. Like, yeah, you've got to read some articles, you've got to learn how to do that. But if you're sitting on the train on your way to class, like, listen to this episode and be able to take in the media in another way. So that's really it for my overview. I did have a question for the panelists, and then if they have any questions they want to ask around too, that would be great, and then we'll open it up to you all. But my question was, what is the student reaction when they find out that they're going to be doing something with comics or pop culture or fandom in your classroom? So I don't know who wants to jump in, if we want to start, maybe down at the end, Jennifer. How do your students react when they find out?
It's kind of a mixed bag. I definitely have some students, usually the cis men, who are like, well, not your comics, I'm going to talk about the history of it. And then other students who actually, which are my favorite, are the ones who don't think they're comic nerds. And so after, especially when we read Uncanny X-Men, I had a student, a woman, who was just like, I'm into comics, I like it, I'm gonna start reading more. And it was like, great, that's kind of what my job is, to let you know that you have a place in that fandom, that you have a place that you might not think you're otherwise welcome to, especially if we think about particularly the X-Men series and comics and movies is these ragtag group of people who just don't fit in anywhere. And so I think for me, really, if I can be like their first entrance into that and like giving them that space to explore that has been really great as like an educator.
Is it?
Yeah, my thoughts are very similar to that. I think people come to the class either, or some kids do, thinking this is an easy class because I know comics. What is this guy going to tell me? So they think they have the misperceptions. It's just going to be a lot of information, and so I think I want to disabuse them of that pretty early on. That this is a class that you can learn a lot of different things. So I think I just sense a tension between fandom and learning or critique. If you will, like I'm a fan myself. So I've had to unlearn a lot of my fandom text, which is like I know more about I spent issue number 139, but whatever it is. So you have to sort of unlearn a lot of that. But I definitely want to reach the students who are there to go deeper and learn something else about it, rather than just a lot of information. The class is not about providing with all the details of the plots of all these comic books. So I think a lot of students just come in thinking it's going to be the easy A. Halfway through, like, oh shit.
I love that though. That's very true, right? Whenever I hit the unit where I'm like, here's some comics, we're going to be like, oh great, I'll be done with this in 5 minutes. And I'm like, well, not after I ask you these questions, right?
Yeah. So it's again kind of mixed because mine is very designed, although I did force them to read comics last week, and that's fun because students who are familiar can help others. They work in groups and they can help one another with how to read these comics, and it just keeps them on their toes. Like, what's she going to do this week? I don't know. But yeah, it's great because my favorite comment I get is, "You've ruined television for me," or "You've ruined blah blah blank blank," because what they mean is they can't watch it without thinking. And if I hear that, mission accomplished. Like that's the goal, is that you will critically engage with what you're doing. You're already doing that. So part of what I want them to do is understand they are already engaging with their world and these concepts in the world at an academic level, and they're bringing in their prior knowledge, they're bringing in their community wealth. They just don't understand that they're doing that. They're walking into it with that. So this is about kind of connecting those two worlds and helping them to really feel empowered and that they have something to contribute, they have something to say. I've had people do podcasts. One project I want to mention I think is so fun is Monsters, Inc. So you're like, what the heck can you do in Monsters, Inc. that relates to sociology? It's about switching from fossil fuels to green energy. Did you know that's what Monsters, Inc. was about? Yeah. Because I didn't until a student made me think about it, and it just went. I was like, oh, cute monsters, blah, blah, whatever, No, it's so they're engaging in why do people resist climate change and the Green New Deal? Who does that? What are the politics around that? There's a lot of places to go there, and how that, like the company in Monsters, Inc. had the vested interest in keeping the scares going,
Yeah, that's funny. That reminds me of another episode we did where we looked at Sorquana's Loa, which is this 17th century. I always forget the order. Right? 1600s. It's this little mini play before the full play, and it's a full allegory with America and religion and these other characters. And I was like, Inside Out, right? And this, like, you have these characters standing in for one another. So, yeah, Pixar, it's definitely a lot deeper than sometimes, like you said, the students will blame you for ruining a certain media for them. That's what happens.
Building on what everyone else said, so when students sign up for my graphic novel class, they may have done so very intentionally, or they may have done so because they needed a writing requirement, and some might not know what a graphic novel is, or they might think that means like adult, like graphic pornography or something. So we kind of unpacked the terminology and the associations they have with, like, why call it a comic book or a graphic novel, or Art Spiegelman calls it comics, the mixture of visuals and text. But I think some students come in underestimating the genre, thinking it'll be easy, but then what we try to focus on is not just the what of the plot, but the how. How does it look? The longer we sit and look at an image on the overhead, the weirder it seems, the more we notice, the more details we start picking apart and dissecting, and that's really fun. There's a great YouTube channel I wanted to mention called Strip Panel Naked, which does a really nice job connecting form, style, and meaning, and it's a nice model of that kind of deep analysis.
Probably doesn't dissuade them from thinking about the graphic narrative in classes.
Repeat that name again.
Strip Panel Naked, and the creator's named Hassan something.
I think for my students, one of the strongest reactions I get, especially when I've taught the America Chavez Volume 1 comics in my Latinas class, and I'll have students come up to me after it, and unless they're surprised, because I actually let them vote on some of the readings that we're going to do in class, and the semester that they chose this particular set of comics, I just had students writing to me saying, like, Professor, I didn't even know there were Latina superheroes. Like, they're seeing themselves represented in these mediums, right? It's not just having to find yourself through some tangential connection, but actually having it in your face, like, she is a queer Latina. And, you know, in the first set, yeah, she comes from the altar, now I forget what it's called, but it's basically she's from another universe, but they do deal with that in the second round of comics, and in terms of addressing how that ties in with her Latina, and they love it. They're just like, I see this, I see me, I see my family in this, and I think that's really important for them as well. So for any of my panelists, do we have questions for one another? I'm going to start there. Nothing in particular? All right, well, we can open it up to audience questions as well. Anything that you have for us in terms of things that you could do, things that you, maybe if you're a student and not an educator, like how you can bring that into your own work in your classroom, even if it's not focused on that. I think we'd be happy to address any of those things. There are microphones, so help yourself or shout if you want.
Use the mic, please.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. This is just amazing. When you assign comics in the classroom, do you assign them as a reading? So, you know, they have to read the books on their own and then, you know, you discuss them in class? Or do you do it as in-class activities where they might read a snippet and then discuss it as a group? I'm just curious as to how you manage the text themselves.
They want to start?
I'll jump in. I'm ready. Ready for this. So for me, I would love to have them read something entirely, but we have to be really cognizant of cost of materials. So for my class, I generally just Xerox. Hopefully this is okay. Fair use. A couple of pages of something, and they look at it in class, and they work together, and then they fill out like kind of a worksheet, and that's homework they can do either online or in class. I have heard of other larger, because I'm teaching 30 students at a time maybe, I've heard of larger sociology courses who use graphic novels as text in lieu of a textbook. So for example, their reading list was something like American-born Chinese, Mouse, and maybe one other, and that's what they purchase instead of a standard 100-level textbook.
Yeah, I've done both as well. In my introductory Latin American Studies class, we do one unit on U.S. Latinos, and for that I scan a few pages out of a much larger book. But in a course that is literature heavy, I will ask them to buy that. Generally, it's one volume. You know, that is the tricky thing. If you're going through a lot of comics, say like, oh, go out and buy these 20 comics. And if you want the students to purchase them, or if you even want to get your bookstore to order them in, they generally have to be the collections, right? You can't just be like, oh, everybody go out this Wednesday and buy the new issue that came out. So you do have to be aware of that in advance. I don't know for anyone else.
I've done like a combination. So for the pop culture media course, I had them actually buy the specific issue for X-Men Uncanny, and they did the digital. So I believe at the time, I think it was Comixology. So like, using like digital media has been a really great way to keep costs down. I've also, if it's going to be like several different comic books or graphic novels, I've done fair use and had a few pages beforehand. And what I'll usually try to do in almost every course, at least, there'll be one graphic novel or comic assigned. So it's like it's an actual text, like anything else on the syllabus. And so in the past, for my Latinx memoir course, I had them read Christine C. Rhodes' Spit and Passion, and we read the whole thing. That's pretty, I think it's less than $20. It's the one, one of several books they've had to purchase. So yeah, definitely keeping in mind comics, but it's always been, it's assigned beforehand on the syllabus, just because I think also to get that buy-in to treat it like any other, novel or textbook, it's good for them to visually see that.
I think my students find that they can very quickly devour these texts once they start reading them, so then in the classroom we have to slow down. One challenge, I think, is some of the more interesting independent comics. Sometimes they become unavailable, especially by artists of color, unfortunately. I've noticed their availability kind of comes and goes, so you have to be careful about what you assign and the cost. Students are very into webcomics, so during the pandemic, we did some things online with webcomics, but we're never going back there again.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Yeah, very similar. I assign a combination of actual comic books to read, which they read before coming to class, and sometimes I'll assign articles by other scholars, so they read that too. And I do have something in mind, like I'll make a budget for when I'm making the syllabus of how much it would cost to get all this stuff. And they know beforehand, this is how many dollars you would have to expend in this course. And I'm often in a special sort of case, if you can't do this, come and talk to me. I'm trying to figure out strategies to overcome that. I also digitized a lot of stuff, which I probably shouldn't have. And it's in a closed website, so it's not publicly available. Like the Days of Future Past comic book, I scanned it, and it's available to students in my course module and stuff like that. So.
I teach at the early college level, so my students are high school juniors and seniors who are actually earning their AA degree alongside their high school diploma. And I teach a comic studies class as a literature elective. And I found that my students are really actually very willing to dive into the hard parts of the course and really work with the analysis, and that a lot of the pushback or confusion I get isn't necessarily from my students, but more from sometimes my colleagues or even my administrators. And so I was curious to hear if you've had experience where you've received pushback, again, not from students, but more from elsewhere in your institutions, and how you handled those pushbacks if you experienced them.
No. In the past, I had an instance where they were like, there's too many comics or there's too many comic memoirs, and they're like, you have to take this off. And I think at the time they wanted me to take off Fun Home, and I was like, no, it's definitely staying on. And then Bechdel won the Genius Award. I didn't run around the department or send them out, but I definitely felt vindicated. I think it helped as I then became an expert myself, especially since I was able to do a dissertation on comics. That also, unfortunately, adds to the cultural wealth and fluency of it. So I think, in terms of pushing back, cite your sources. There's just like a total, in terms of comic studies and graphic novel studies, there's just so many books, published articles all the time. So giving a reading list, a syllabus to your administrators, perhaps. And letting them see that we are all professionals who are really invested in this, and let them know that, like anything else, it's real literature to be read. And also getting input from the students might be something that's also important. Maybe part of the end of the year or mid-semester feedback. And that's something else that might be helpful, because that's another thing I think administrators listen to is students, who are the customers.
So I was part of this program that CUNY has been doing for the last year and this year. It's called Transformative Learning in the Humanities, and so we really have gotten a lot of flexibility with how we approach our classes in a way of making it student-centered learning, and sort of, again, as Jennifer was saying, if you could say, hey, look, here's the proof that this stuff does work, that our students are getting something from this, then they're going to encourage you to do it. And having them like create their own comics or create a podcast or make a video about this pop culture stuff, but bringing in the sociological terms, the historical factors, etc., like literary terms. If you can say, hey, this is what I want the students to do, they're still going to meet the course goals, the requirements that you maybe as the college have set out, or even the pre-college, right? Because that's sort of in that in-between zone where it's like they're still held to a certain rigid, I don't know what the word is, but like it's almost like they're policed a little bit more in school in terms of like getting their work done.
They have to be both high school students and college students at the
Right.
same time. It's a really difficult thing for them to navigate and can also be challenging as an educator.
Yeah.
I have a lot of students in that position. We call it concurrent enrollment. Am I cool to jump in?
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
So who's a community college teacher or qualifies? Okay. Are you familiar with the Mellon ACLS Community College Fellowship Program? It's a wonderful program. So I recommend if you need people to support your project to get that grant, because I did. Anyway, just shameless plug, but I've been studying fandom and fan culture, especially charity work in fandom, and I have a book coming out.
I was going to ask about that.
Thank you. So anyway, I haven't faced a lot of resistance, but that lends a lot of legitimacy, and I want everyone to know about this grant funding. And then, so when a community college faculty is perceived as a legitimate academic and a legitimate researcher, as well as a teaching professor, and getting that kind of publicity really helped me to be able to accomplish what I want to do. But I would say also going to the students and providing student feedback, that's going to speak directly, I think, to administrators. How many people are familiar with the Popular Culture Association? PCA, ACA, okay. So there's also fan studies networks, and there's people like us, y'all, who are nerdy, geeky academic people, and there's all kinds of anything you could think about. There is academics looking at it and talking about it. I think getting something in a journal like that, or showing that your work with students can benefit them and can kind of raise the profile of your school or your program, that helps. Like for me, being able to be covered by local newspapers, they could say, look at this person who got this award, and that's why I get to come do stuff like this. So yeah. It's called the Mellon, MELLON ACLS, American
Council
of Learned Societies. And they, unfortunately, I feel like the application period just finished. But for next year, there's a specific community college fellowship they started a few years ago. And what it does for us is wonderful, is it gives us, we can apply for course release. Because a lot of you may know our teaching load is extremely heavy. And that precludes us from spending time on, transcribing interviews and things like that. So that can help.
I'm a college professor at King's College, and I taught a course on superheroes and comic books. But I'd like to make two comments. First is, in terms of like access to comic books, one thing that I found useful is that a lot of times I would assign like one graphic novel, so like Dark Phoenix Saga. And my students would have it for the semester, and then I had a student come up to me first semester I taught it and said, I don't really need this anymore, would you like it? And I thought, that might be a really great resource to kind of build a library, so students who couldn't afford it, I would put in the syllabus, come see me, I have some extra copies, I would lend them to them. So I think that is a possible way of doing that.
The panel that was in here before us, they were talking about validity, I think, is a website where you can kind of catalog your collection and and then the students can like check them out, and then you can kind of keep tabs on them to get them back at the end of the semester if you so desire. But it got me thinking, like, yeah, I always have these comic books, and I'm like, oh, you should check this out. But if the student doesn't go out and get it on their own, or isn't able to get it out on their own, then they're not going to take that for their final project. But otherwise, they're like, oh, that sounds really cool. Here, if I can lend it to you, you know. And again, picking and choosing what things you're willing to put out and share with others, and which are your sort of precious copies.
And if I could make a second point, you talk about PCA, ACA. Absolutely a great organization. I've done many presentations. I'm part of the comic book part of it. And so I would highly encourage people to join it. The next convention is in San Antonio next spring. They're taking applications for panels. They are really looking forward to people who do the kind of work that y'all are doing.
And they're a regional version.
NYCC regional, and just to say, shout out also, I know the first year I went, I applied for a travel grant and they covered that. So just, there are resources for us, those of us who are budgeted, limited.